The Portland Trail Blazers currently have the best roster that they have ever had in the Damian Lillard era, but just how far can they go? Make sure to like and subscribe, and let's talk about it. So the most successful team that the Blazers have ever had with Dame was in 2019 when they went to the Western Conference Finals and ultimately lost to the Dynasty Warriors. However, following that successful 2019 campaign, the Blazers had a very rough start to the 2020 season, considering that they lost Enes Kanter, Seth Curry, Al-Farouq Aminu, and had lost Jusuf Nurkic to injury for a majority of the season. And while they did bring in Hassan Whiteside, as well as a couple other pieces such as Trevor Ariza through a mid-season trade, they really were not the same team as the previous season, and it was shown in their record as they had a losing record at the time that the NBA season was shut down. But that shutdown really proved to be a blessing in disguise for them, as the team really reached their true potential in the bubble behind an amazing performance from Damian Lillard. And with Dame being the bubble MVP, as he averaged an astounding 44 points per game, nearly 9 assists per game, on basically 55 and 48 splits, the Blazers were able to sneak their way into the play-in game where they would defeat the Memphis Grizzlies and thus win the 8th seed in the Western Conference. Another big piece of the bubble season for Portland was the emergence of some key role players. This includes Gary Trent Jr., a great wing player who became an exceptional 3-and-D player off of the bench, Anthony Simons, who was a very solid backup point guard behind Dame, as well as the resurgence of Carmelo Anthony. And you may say, well, that was cool and all, but they still got blown out by the Lakers in the first round. And while, yes, they did lose 4-1, it was a very competitive series for only being 5 games. Obviously, game 1 they came out and won, and surprised a lot of people, and showed that it would be an actual series. Game 2 was very close up until the very end, but then they kind of blew it in the last few minutes, and that kind of dragged out the scoreline. Game 3, you get a similar situation. I actually thought the Blazers were going to win this game as I was watching it, but ultimately they did lose by 8. And then game 4 is when Damian Lillard gets injured, and that's the point when everybody's like, okay, yeah, this is over. It was a good run, guys. So the Blazers went on to lose game 4 once Lillard got injured, and then at that point, Damian Lillard decided to not risk his health and sit out the final game, which they did ultimately end up losing. And even though it was a 4-1 loss, I feel like it was a statement series regardless for Portland, as they proved that they were competitive in the first few games before Dame got injured. But you know the NBA media, they see Dame loses to LA, and they're like, Dame doesn't have enough help, he obviously has to go to LA, there's no other option here. And there's the usual, this team isn't a contender at all, and you should just trade Dame now talk that there is every single offseason with this team, but per usual, the Blazers do not listen to it, which I think is a smart move, as being a small market team in Portland, you have to hold on to any stars that you get, and they have found their star in Damian Lillard, and they've built some competitive rosters around him, and they keep improving. And I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but yeah, the Blazers decided to keep Dame and stay competitive. And that leads us into the offseason. And after some of the losses that they incurred in the 2019 offseason, they needed to rebound here, and they did. As in their first move of the offseason, they acquired Robert Covington from the mess of a Houston Rockets organization that exists right now, and they only had to give up Trevor Ariza and the 16th overall pick in this draft, which ended up being Isaiah Stewart out of Washington. And this is a great move for Portland, as it really fills a hole that's been there since the 2019 offseason, in which they lost Al-Farouq Aminu. Rocco is really the ideal wing that you'd want around Dame and CJ. He's a great defender, he's a versatile defender, and he's a spot-up shooter. He's also a solid rebounder, and as we saw in Houston, he is able to play both the 3 and the 4, so they'll have some flexibility in that regard. So that was a great way to start the offseason, and then they took it a step further by going to acquire Enes Kanter from the Boston Celtics. Now, people that know me know that as a Celtics fan, I absolutely hated Enes Kanter, but I do have to admit that he played his best basketball in that 2019 season with the Trailblazers, and he is the sort of player that they are looking for in a backup center. And on top of that, they really didn't have to give up anything. They just had to trade Mario Hezonja away, who didn't get a ton of game time anyways, and you're bringing in new players to fill that position. You still have Nasir Little to fill in that position, so that's really not a big loss at all. So they made 2 very good trades in the beginning of the offseason, and then we move into free agency, where they made only a few signings, but they are very good good signings. First, they extended Rodney Hood to a 2-year, $21 million contract, and he's just another great shooting option off the bench. He can play great around guards like Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. He can play both the 2 and the 3, and he is an underrated shot creator if you want to bring him in a situation where you don't have Dame or CJ on the floor and he can create some offense. And of course, he had that iconic game against the Denver Nuggets in the 2019 playoffs where he came in like the 3rd or 4th overtime and had like 10 points in one overtime period. So it's just nice to bring a guy like that back into your team. Following that, they went out and signed Derrick Jones Jr. from Miami, and he also got a 2-year contract worth about $19 million, which I'm guessing is their mid-level exception. And again, I think that's a good signing just because it is more depth at the wing position, especially coming off the bench. Like I said before, they've been really lacking there in the last year or two, and it's always just good to bring in another scoring option there. And finally, one of my favorite signings of anybody this offseason is they brought in Harry Giles on a 1-year, basically minimum contract. And I love this signing for a few reasons. First of all, just because of the insane upside that he has long-term for this team. People sometimes forget he was the #1 recruit coming out of high school, and he was viewed as the best incoming freshman on a Duke team, which included freshman Jason Tatum. But unfortunately, his career has really been derailed due to injuries. However, there is always that chance that he will figure it out and turn into the player that he was once thought to be, and if that happens, you got him for a minimum contract, and that is an absolute steal. And while in all likelihood that won't happen, at bare minimum, he is still just another solid end of rotation big to give some rest to Jusuf Nurkic or Zach Collins or Enes Kanter. And we know that rotation of big men has seen some injury issues over recent times, so it's always good to have more depth in a position where you may deal with some injuries. So if we look at the roster now, and as per my Nets video, this is the projected lineup according to ESPN. The starting 5 is going to be Dame, CJ, Rocco, Zach Collins once he is healthy, and Jusuf Nurkic. And then the bench will include Simons, Gary Trent, Rodney Hood, Melo, and Enes Kanter. And then they'll also have rookie CJ Elubi, as well as Nas Little and Derrick Jones in the 3rd string territory. And that is a rotation that legitimately is going to be 12 deep if Nasir Little develops this year, which I think he will. And that makes for one of the deepest teams in the league. And now looking at the roster as a whole, obviously they're going to be led by great guard play in Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. And at this point, I think Dame is pretty much a certified top 10 player. He's on the borderline superstar category. Even though I wouldn't quite put him there, he's at least in that discussion. And then CJ is a borderline all-star year in and year out, but he doesn't get it a lot of the time because he plays in that tough Western Conference. And then looking at the bigs, they have some solid pick and roll scoring punches that can play off Dame and CJ and Simons on the bench in the pick and roll or just within the flow of the offense to provide some more scoring for this team. And obviously with their backcourt of Dame and CJ, defense is always going to come into question, but they have at least improved in that aspect this season with the acquisition of Robert Covington as well as the emergence of Gary Trent as a two-way player. So while they won't be a good defensive team, they'll at least be better than they were last year. So clearly they're going to be a very offense-focused team behind an offense-focused coach in Terry Stotts. And in case you need any proof of this, last season they averaged 115 points per game, but they gave up 116 points per game, and that made them the 3rd best team in the league in offensive rating, but the 27th best team in the league in defensive rating. So they're really just going to try to outscore you, and with the personnel they have on this team, they can pull that off pretty often. And I think a lot of their success is going to depend on health. Can Nurkic stay healthy this year? When does Zach Collins return? And then are the older guys on the team, like Carmelo Anthony, going to hold up and be consistent throughout the regular season? So where does this team rank in the ever so tough Western Conference? Obviously, the Lakers are the best team. They just won the championship and somehow improved in the offseason, so I think they're pretty much everybody's favorites to win the West in the regular season again this year. And looking at teams more on the same level as them, I think they're better than Utah. I think they're better than Dallas. They should be better than the Warriors without Klay Thompson. And I'm not really sure what's going on with Houston. There's a chance Houston gets back to their old form. but they're very unpredictable, so I will say that Portland will finish above them. So to me, that leaves them in the 2 through 4 seed with the Clippers and with the Nuggets. And it's going to be very close between those three. I think they could finish in any order. Obviously, they can finish in any order, but I think that's going to be one of the closest races when we get down to the end of the season. But to pull this off, they need everybody to be at their highest level all season long. They need Dame to be pretty much an MVP candidate and establish himself as a true superstar. As I mentioned, he's kind of on that border. He has to get past that border in order for them to be a serious contender this year. And I really think one of the biggest factors is consistency from their big men. Now, granted, he was coming off injury, but I really did not like Yusuf Nurkic in the bubble. I found his effort to be pretty poor. For his size, he was really not rebounding how he should be. I don't know how his numbers looked, but just watching the games, there were a few instances where it's like, come on, dude, there's no way you don't get to that. And then obviously you have Zach Collins coming back from injury now. You have Melo, who's known to be inconsistent of recent times, and you're not really sure how much you're gonna get out of Harry Giles. And while I sound pretty negative about all of these pieces, I do expect them to reach at least, let's say, 80% of what they're supposed to be. I think they'll all play as they're expected, and because of that, I do see them being a legitimate threat in the West. But what exactly does legitimate threat mean in terms of the playoffs? Well, first of all, I think they should try to avoid the Lakers. I mean, obviously, any team should avoid the Lakers, but specifically, their bigs are terrible on defense, so they really just can't guard Anthony Davis, and I don't see them beating LA in a series should they match up. So I think the realistic ceiling for this team is trying to get a top 3 seed to avoid LA. And then with how tough the West is, the first couple rounds will be tough. They could play a team like the Rockets or the Mavericks. There are just so many teams in the West that they could play in the first round. And then in the second round, I expect them to play either Denver or the Clippers. And that's going to be a very competitive series either way it goes. And while they will struggle against Jokic with the Nuggets, they obviously proved that they can beat the Nuggets in 2019 when they beat them to get to the conference finals. And one of Jokic's biggest strengths is his playmaking, so if you can take away all other options and force him to be a score-first player, that's a solid strategy that could lead you to winning against Denver. And then with the Clippers, it will be tough going against their perimeter defense with PG and Kawhi, as well as Patrick Beverley. But I do expect Yusuf Nurkic to have a very good series if this were to happen, and they don't have a dominant big to try to defend like they would against the Lakers or the Nuggets. So it'll be close, but I do think this team has a good chance of getting to the Western Conference Finals, and I'd say that's their realistic ceiling or goal for this season. But obviously they do want to push for more, and they do want to try to win a championship. And if they were to get lucky and not have to play the Lakers in the playoffs, say the Clippers fall to the 4 seed and play the Lakers in the second round and beat them there, then I think there's a real chance that this team could go to the finals or even win the finals, but it's going to take some luck to make that happen. And of course, there always is the chance of them beating the Lakers if they do match up, as nobody expected the Nuggets to get past the Clippers in this past playoffs, and nobody expected the Miami Heat to make the finals, so once again, anything is possible. But realistically, to have a chance at winning a championship, they will have to avoid the Lakers. And looking at things from a broader perspective, I think this season will be very defining for the future of the team. If they're as good as I'm hyping them up to be, I think there's a real chance that Dame is a Blazer for life, and they should continue to be serious contenders for the next 5 years or however long Damian Lillard remains in his prime. Looking at a worst case scenario though, if this team somehow isn't in the playoff contention, which I really don't think would happen, or if they get swept in the first round or something like that, I think there is a good chance that Terry Stotts will get fired, as this is clearly the best team that he's had, and if he can't get to where they should be at this point, then he might be gone. And maybe at that point they will have to consider trading Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum, but I really don't think it's going to come to that. I think this team should be pretty good. I think they will be a top 4 seed in the Western Conference this season, and I hope that they do get it together, as I really do like Dame, and it's cool to see somebody so committed to an organization as Damian Lillard is committed to Portland. Very rare to see a superstar stay with one team for that long these days, and I think it would just be really cool for the league if Damian Lillard stays in Portland for the rest of his career. But that is all for this video. Let me know how good you think the Blazers will be in the comment section, and of course, like this video and subscribe to the channel, as well as turn post notifications on. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.